Hi, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Uh, I see people still filtering in, but we can get started at least talking about a bit of housekeeping. One, thank you for joining us. We are recording this webinar, and we'll make that recording available afterwards, as well as the slides that we go through. So there's not a need to take a lot of screenshots as we're going through this. Additionally, we do try to answer questions during the webinar. It's a little bit tricky because I can't see the question section as I'm talking, but I keep my little Slack window open here, and Yvonne, who's in there in the chat window, he'll message me with any questions, and I'll try to respond to them as we go through it. We do try to make it at least somewhat interactive. Good morning to you, Karthi. And in addition, we have some poll questions there. We really do appreciate it if you take a look at those and respond. It's helpful feedback for us in terms of what we're doing with our product, as well as what we do with these webinars. So we do appreciate it if you take a look at that section. And with that, I am going to share my screen here, and we can get started. So today we're talking about accelerating development and certification via automated testing. We're going to go through some introductions. We're going to provide some general information about what we do at Bespoken, talk about testing, talk about how it really helps with certification, do a bit of a demonstration on how we do end-to-end testing and continuous testing, and then leave some time at the end for questions. So in terms of introductions, I'm John Kelvey. I'm the CEO and founder of Bespoken. Also on this webinar in the chat window there is Yvonne Perez, who leads our customer success and marketing, as well as Karen Guerrero, who's part of our marketing team. They're probably saying hi there in the chat window. In terms of what we do as a company, we provide monitoring and testing tools for voice apps. We're a recognized vendor of Amazon and Google, and we have over 1,000 apps that we monitor and more than 3,500 developers using our tools. We also have a long history with speech recognition and AI, both the scaling and the testing of it. Prior to Bespoken, I was actually building a speech recognition system that worked on mobile. And there's a lot of learnings for me there, in particular around how essential testing is. Testing is always critical for any system, but in particular when working with AI, there's some particular challenges. And just broadly, the sort of experience that we had was that there's always side effects with development, but particularly for AI-based systems, there's maybe more side effects by the nature of it, and it turns it into sort of an optimization problem. So you're not trying to necessarily perfect things as much as maximize the usability and the experience for your users. And what that means is that you're going to be not just trying to solve for one particular case, but just making sure that your speech recognition works as well as possible across many different cases, knowing that as you make modifications, it's liable to change its performance. And so you really need a great automated test suite to look across the performance of the entire system, not just make changes in sort of a localized way without looking at that sort of total performance. That was a huge learning for me, and that's really informs what we're doing here at Bespoken. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, in terms of some of those key considerations for testing with AI, You know, one aspect that we highlight here on the left is that these are systems that are constantly evolving. They're based on machine learning, and that's generally considered a good thing. The idea is that your system is going to be constantly improving. But the other side of that is that those changes, they can affect the predictability of your system. They can change the types of inputs that your app is going to get and potentially break things. And so the best way to inoculate yourself against those changes is to have a really great testing regimen in place. Additionally, languages and locales. This is always a huge challenge. I don't think internationalization is ever an easy thing to do, but particularly when you're talking about AI-based systems and speech recognition-based systems, language becomes the primary input. And so if you take an internationalization issue on mobile, where maybe you mislabel a button, it doesn't read in a natural way to somebody in their native language, they can still probably work through your mobile app then. They might think, gee, these people don't really get me, but at least they're able to use it still. Versus if you don't understand the way in which people speak for a voice app, and you don't handle it, to them, it's not going to be any different, the experience, than if your API didn't work, or if something goes wrong with Alexa or your database. It's all just going to feel like, hey, this app didn't handle my input, didn't know how to respond to me. And so it goes from being something that's sort of a usability issue and something that's suboptimal to something that feels altogether broken. So it's always important dealing with languages and locales, but for speech systems, it's really critical. And then the last thing that we highlight over here on the right is the platform behavior. So there's two platforms that we're dealing with most frequently, Google and Amazon, but there's new platforms that are coming on. Samsung's coming out with stuff. There's obviously Siri. Facebook is supposedly coming out with their own device. Ensuring consistent behavior across platforms, the best way to do it, again, is through testing. And a couple of very tricky scenarios, even within that we would kind of highlight. These are just interesting issues that we've seen so far. There's an accent gap that the Washington Post wrote about, in which the performance for Spanish and Chinese accents on the platforms was really significantly degraded versus some of the other accents that you might see. And this highlights some of the challenges that you have for usability. If you're not understanding someone with a Spanish accent, or your app isn't working for them, that's going to really degrade their experience of it. Another challenge with speech recognition and AI, an issue that we see is, the environment in which someone is talking. If people are talking in a noisy environment, if they're in a car or if they're in a workplace in which there's a lot of background noise, that's going to also affect performance. These are somewhat subtle issues, but they go to the challenges of working in this, brave new speech-based world. And the overall point that we kind of drive at, and our perspective on voice and testing for it, is that what's happening with these applications is that AI is really making a lot of the traditional tasks for building applications simpler. There's things like the dialogue interface, natural language processing, contextual understanding. All of these things can make our jobs as software developers and the software teams simpler. But then the other side of that is, as it makes things easier, it puts more of a burden on us to then confirm behavior and make sure things are working correctly. As the AI assumes more and makes more guesses, often correctly on our behalf, we then need to build great testing systems to ensure that it is doing those things correctly, and that it's doing the right things for our users. So we see overall this as a movement towards a more test-centric software development mode. And so it's something that's it's a big change. It's sort of a paradigm shift for us as software engineers that we're really just at the front end of. And so, we're trying to get ahead of it with the tools that we provide. And that's that goes to our great slide here. We depict Iron Man. It's not just because we think he's really cool. It's because we're trying to emphasize that automation, we believe that it's a superpower. And so the reason why we pick on Iron Man is he's just sort of a regular guy who through this incredible suit becomes much more powerful. Well, we believe that using tools can take a regular software developer and QA person and make them much more powerful. There's this sort of myth out there about a 10x developer or a 10x QA person. We think that actually there are such people, but it's not about suddenly becoming 10 times more skillful or 10 times more knowledgeable. Instead, it's about leveraging tools and leveraging automation. That's how you can do things far more efficiently. And if we talk about the development scenario, if you leverage our automated unit testing tools, you can actually do all your development locally on your machine. And that saves you from very slow deployment cycles in which you're pushing out updates to an interaction model, to Alexa, in which you're pushing out code changes to Lambda. That's going to really slow down your whole development cycle. I think, easily can be by an order of magnitude. Similarly, on the QA side, if you're only doing manual testing, it's very tedious, it's very time consuming, and it's quite error prone. If instead you have an automated test suite, you can run through a lot more scenarios much faster. The fact is, when it comes to QA, if all you can do is QA in a manual way, you're really going to be stuck looking at just sort of doing core test cases, doing, essentially smoke tests, and not getting into really a deep regression. It's only through automation that you can really achieve really good coverage, especially when you start to talk about more complex interaction models. If you have scenarios, and we see customers with this, where you might have be handling slots where there are hundreds or thousands of values. If you're not using automation, the fact is you're just not going to test those scenarios. And you're just going to be guessing in terms of whether or not they work right. That's really not a great thing for your users. So automation is going to make things much faster, and it's going to enable you to do a lot more. And in particular, in the context of certification, automation and testing are even more critical or particularly helpful here. In general, when thinking about the skill certification process, there's three major buckets of considerations. One is your functional testing, and this is about making sure that your app is behaving correctly. So you have some sort of functional specification for what that app should do, and your testing is focused on making sure that it does do those things. So that's one part of it. But another part is there's usability guidelines that Amazon provides, and those usability guidelines are just generally good things that any voice application should do. And that's about stuff like contextual help. So if a user asks for help, the messaging that they're provided actually makes sense for what they're doing. It's about having graceful slot handling. So if people, when they're asked to provide input, if they say something that doesn't make sense in the context, or if they don't provide a particular value, that you actually come back and elicit the right information in a nice way. It's things like the performance of an invocation name. This can be kind of a tricky one, but making sure that your invocation name is unique and actually is recognized correctly. These are all usability considerations that are taken into account by the certification team. The last bucket is the security considerations. Now, the automated testing tools that we provide don't have a lot to say about this. That's more of a plumbing thing, but it's also an important area. So what's the advantage of using Bespoken for these things? Well, by using automated tests, you can be very thorough. As I mentioned before, you can cover a great range of test cases in a way that if you're doing it manually is very challenging. And frankly, very tedious, as I mentioned. Once you've set up all those automated test cases, the really great thing is that then it's repeatable. You can run them again. So, typically we set up our test cases relatively early in the development process, and then as development is completed, then you're running them, providing feedback, making any fixes that are necessary, and then doing final tests before it goes into submission. And then once you've submitted it, if for some reason there's any issues, you can run them again as you make fixes for it to resubmit. And if you're resubmitting later on because you've gone into another development cycle or you've just updated the interaction model to fix a bug, all of those things, those are going to really accelerate your process, for certification. And then finally, it's reportable, meaning that we generate these nice artifacts as part of running tests. And so you have the tests themselves that are all written out, and then you have all the results provided. Having those results, it's not unusual. I think anybody who's been in software development for any period of time, you've run into the scenario where somebody comes back and says, hey, did anybody actually test this? And if it's not working correctly, you find yourself saying, well, I think I tested it, or, I have this notation that I tested it, but yeah, what did happen there? Well, if you're using automated tests, you have all the tests written out, you have the results for the time that you ran them at, and if it's some sort of regression bug, you can say, well, stuff does happen. Maybe it's not working now, but at 10 a.m. Last Friday, it was. And that's helpful in terms of showing that you've done all the work that's necessary. It's also helpful in terms of spotting any missing areas or any blank spaces in your testing. Because if it's a scenario that you didn't cover, add it to your automated test suite, and then next time you'll have that covered off on. So having that history, that sort of reporting, it's really a great benefit, for your other stakeholders that are involved. Just looking at a question here. So Jeffrey asks, since Amazon doesn't allow you to own your invocation name, what do you recommend to address this? In terms of picking an invocation name that's sort of optimized for SEO or is unique versus other invocation names, that's, we don't have a lot of guidance on that. It's just, our thing is making sure that you have an invocation name that's going to work well within their guidelines, that it be 2 or 3 words, and that it not be confused with core functionality of the system. That's what you're going to get dinged on during certification. There's also considerations around just having a great invocation name. I can't say that I have a lot of guidance on that. Obviously distinguishing yourself from other skills that are already out there that may be popular is a good thing, but that's, at least at this time, that's outside the purview of what we can do with automation. One other thing, that we do offer here, so everything that I've described so far, the people that, are listening to this webinar, you can just go ahead and start using it. So if you're a QA person, a developer, even if you're not any of these things, you can take a look at our documentation and get started setting up automated tests very easily. You don't need to have any sort of development background. we've tried to make it as simple as possible, and our users have been, I would say to date, very successful with it. However, if you want help with this, we have expert testers very familiar with the submission guidelines, and they can actually implement the test on your behalf. So this is a service that we provide as Bespoken. It's something that we're excited to offer to our customers, and if it's of interest to you, please reach out to us. So how do we do all these pieces for accelerating development and accelerating the certification process? Well, this gets to the bread and butter of what we do as Bespoken. And in particular, we have this cake drawing over here on the right-hand side, and this depicts the 4 layers of testing. And so at the top, we have manual testing, and this is really about making sure that your app is working in a basic way, doing testing in an ad hoc fashion, typically using a device or the Alexa skill testing console. There's a number of nice tools to do it with, and it's a good starting point for doing your testing. But it shouldn't be the end point. The layer below that is we have automated unit testing. And this is really for developers to do. And this is about making sure that your code is working correctly. This is about making sure that the logic of the app itself is really perfect. This is not going to do anything to ensure the behavior of speech recognition or any of the AI components, but it is going to make sure that your code is correct. So it's a really important step, and it's one that can save you a heck of a lot of time and really improve the quality of your skill. The layer below that, we have end-to-end testing. And this is the other side of the coin to the unit testing. This is about making sure that the skill as a whole works. And in particular, it's about making sure that those AI pieces work correctly. So those challenges that I was mentioning before, end-to-end testing is really the best way to address them. It's what's going to help you address different languages, different accents, different quirks of the interaction model. This is a great way to do it. And hopefully it doesn't confuse things, but I've actually started talking about this as, you can think of the classic unit testing, which is about making sure your code works correctly. End-to-end testing, another way to look at it is that it's unit testing for your interaction model. It's unit testing of the AI parts of your app. It also does comprehensively test things, but there's sort of this new idea that we've come up with, or that we're thinking about, where it's, how do you ensure the behavior of the AI? And that is really your end-to-end testing piece. So then the last layer that we show here is the continuous testing. And the continuous testing, it leverages the same pieces that we use for end-to-end testing, but we're then running it on a routine basis. We run it every 30 minutes. And so the continuous testing we also refer to as monitoring. It's going to simulate someone speaking to your skill, run through a simple script, and it does it on a regular basis and alerts you if there's any issues. So just a little more detail on these different layers. Like I said, manual testing, there's a number of ways to do it. We do offer manual testing tools, and what I would highlight about them is that we leverage an emulator. And it's an emulator that we've created. And what that means is that we create JSON payloads that look like they're coming from Alexa. And I should also highlight, we do support Google Assistant as well. So what I'm saying here applies to that additionally. And so with that emulator, it's going to make it look like there's a payload coming from Alexa, but it doesn't actually have to go through Alexa. So it's just running locally. And that distinction is really important. The ability to run it locally, it allows you to do a heck of a lot of testing, debugging, without ever having to do a deployment. This is a huge time saver. It allows for much faster development cycles. And you can take advantage of that using these manual tools that we have. And I would say, probably more importantly, you can take advantage of that emulator within the unit testing, because we use it there as well. So for the unit testing, we're generating payloads locally on the laptop and sending it directly to your skill code. That's a really helpful thing. It runs extremely fast, and it allows you to set up very comprehensive unit tests for a skill. And then once you have those unit tests set up, you have all these terrific development tools, this incredible rich ecosystem that's out there that you can then hook it into. So once you set up some unit tests, you can tie it into GitHub and have it set up so that anytime somebody makes changes, those unit tests are automatically run. That's going to let you know if at any point any of your changes break anything. You can tie it into code coverage tools, and you get great reports. I actually show a report here from CodeCov. That's a really helpful tool that's out there. That's going to show you how well your unit tests are covering all your code and ensuring its correctness. And it's also going to show you how over time your code quality is improving or degrading. So it's a really helpful thing. You can take advantage of all these other tools really easily once you set up some unit tests. It's really very simple to set those pieces up. Something we would highlight about what we've done unit testing wise is that Amazon agrees with the approach that we've taken or likes the approach. They've actually started including us in their different samples and tutorials. And you can take a look at those. We put a link to one of the samples right there. But so then the end-to-end testing, as we mentioned before, this is the other side of testing. And so this is about testing your skill as a whole. This is about also making sure that speech recognition and AI works correctly. We're going to go into a little bit more depth on this, but the way in which we do this is we actually generate audio that looks like it's coming from an actual speaker. We send it to Alexa. That in turn sends it to your skill. The skill comes back with a reply. At least part of that reply is typically an audio response. We turn that back into text, and then we compare it to the expected response. So it's actually, the test scripts that we write are really simple. We'll show them to you in a moment, but it's actually doing a lot of complicated stuff under the covers. And in doing that stuff, it allows us to test that interaction model and test the complete behavior of the skill. And so just before I go further, I see that there's a couple questions. Will support for echo buttons be added to the emulator? That's a great question, Ben. I can actually show you how to do that now. We don't have a simple shorthand way to do it, but you can actually set up requests today to test buttons. So I can show you an example of how to do that with the existing tools as they are. It's actually not too tricky. And I see there's another question from Jeffrey. Since Amazon's NLU models are constantly changing, I've heard of cases in which audio was correctly recognized but was no longer recognized properly. Do you have the facility to record audio responses to Alexa prompts and verify that they are correctly understood? Yes, so that's an essential thing that we actually provide. Now, we don't do this through using recorded audio, though. The way in which we do it is that we generate audio. We actually use Poly for this. And that makes it very easy to work with, for one thing, because you can just type out what you want to say, and then it does identify cases like this. And we've seen on several occasions cases in which things that were recognized are no longer recognized properly. And it can really vary based on the speaker. We've noticed, that something will stop working for a male voice that we're using, but if we change it to a female voice, it still works. We've seen those sort of interaction problems happen, and we've even been able to fix those issues by changing around the interaction model. Other times we might just report them to Amazon or, just sort of live with it. There's not always an easy answer, but it's definitely helpful to know when those sorts of issues do come up, and have test cases for it. And that's something that's very easy to do with the tools that we provide. The last piece that I mentioned, we do this continuous testing. Again, we leverage the same end-to-end testing techniques, but we're running this on a regular basis. What you're going to run for a continuous test, it's not going to be the same depth as you would for end-to-end testing. For end-to-end testing, you might have hundreds or thousands of test cases that you're going to go through as part of a test suite. That's not practical to run on a 30-minute basis. For continuous testing, you're going to have a basic sequence that you run through. That's going to make sure that all the different parts of the skill are working correctly. It's going to make sure that any infrastructure you rely on is working correctly. As long as everything is working right, all you're going to get is a weekly summary from us. But if there's any sort of problem, we'll send you an email right away, let you know that there's an issue. We'll also let you know once it gets resolved. So it's a very helpful tool, very easy to set up, and it gives you this peace of mind that your skill is working correctly. The continuous testing, you can set this up in our dashboard. It takes about 5 minutes to set up a basic test. So just one other thing to go through before we do a little bit of a demonstration of how the end-to-end testing works. But we put together this, what we refer to as an automation atlas. And what this depicts is how our tools work as part of an overall automation suite. And so this is based on a case study that we put together for Mercedes. You can see this on our website under the customer section. But this sort of distills it down to the key aspects, which is that we pulled together unit tests, end-to-end tests, and continuous testing with best-in-class tools for code coverage, for continuous integration, to really put together a really streamlined workflow. So the way this stuff works together is anytime somebody makes changes, we run unit tests against it. We run integration tests. If there's any issues at all, people get a notification. If it's working correctly, code coverage is updated. And you see a new report on that. And if it's something that's a piece of development that's completed, that's ready for testing, it's actually automatically deployed out. And we use Jenkins and the Ask CLI to do that. So we actually automatically deploy it. And then at that point, we run end-to-end tests on it. If anything bad happens with those end-to-end tests, if there's any errors, there's, again, a notification sent. We then follow that same process as code moves into production. So you'll go through a testing phase, for a lot of folks. And then once you're completed with that testing phase, then the next step is to update into production. That will often correlate with pushing things into a new branch within source code control. So once you do those updates, again, that deployment is done automatically. End-to-end tests are run automatically. If there's any issues at all, you'll be notified right away. Ideally, you wouldn't ever have issues when there's a deployment to production. But if you do, it's much better to know right away. So having those end-to-end tests during QA is really beneficial in terms of doing a complete regression. Having it in production makes sure that you can, again, have a real peace of mind that everything is working right, that there's not some blind spot in your development process that you missed. And then lastly, on the top right there, you see our logo, and you see what we labeled the Bespoken overlook. That's just to say that we leverage our continuous testing to keep an eye on the system once it's live. So this is a really streamlined workflow. We see this as sort of an ideal state for testing and automation. And it's a great process that we put together working with Mercedes-Benz R&D. If you haven't checked out that whole case study, really encourage you to do that. All right, so at this point, I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of a walkthrough on how the end-to-end testing works, and how we set up these test cases to use them for development and for testing for certification. So over here, this is a project that we put together. This is actually available in GitHub. We provide a link within the presentation to it. But this project, it's to test a skill called Bring. We use this skill for testing because it's in a couple different languages, and it's also just a very simple skill to work with. This is a grocery list skill, just has 3 intents, add, list, and remove. So it's very easy to understand, but it's a nice way to show how easy it is to write these tests, as well as how we can work across different languages. If we take a look at this test file here, this first test is really about as simple of a test as you can construct. And it says open Bring, that's the input, and then the expected response is welcome to Bring. And so the open Bring, this is what we're saying to Alexa or Google Assistant, I should mention again. And what we do with this text is we use Amazon Polly to turn it into speech and to send that to Alexa. And then that in turn goes to your skill. In turn, the skill comes back with a response. That response is in audio. We turn that back into text and we compare it to this expected response here. So this is a really simple test to set up, but there's actually a lot of stuff happening underneath the covers with it. But then if we go down here, the second test, this is a slightly more complex example. And here we're actually having a conversation. It's not just one interaction. There's 4 interactions here. And we're saying open, then we're asking what's on our list, then we're adding an item to our list, and then we're saying goodbye. So we're able to work through a sequence of interactions. You'll also notice there's a wildcard used here. This is a nice thing, so you don't have to do an exact match on the response. You can use a wildcard to sort of have some looseness to the match. This is helpful for things that might vary, like if it was a checking account, if you're checking the balance of a checking account, maybe that balance varies, but that's not essential to the test. You can use a wildcard there. You can use a wildcard for all these items that are on the list. It makes it easy to set up tests that are robust. Similarly, if you have some variability to your response, which is a recommended user experience thing, to make it feel more conversational, you can set up multiple accepted responses. So you can say, talk to you soon, or bye-bye, happy shopping. Either one of those responses will be accepted, which is a nice thing. And then bottom here, we get to an even more complex test. And so in this case, we're actually testing beyond just what that audio response is, but we get into testing other parts of the JSON response. So we don't just get back the audio response. There's actually a whole bunch of JSON that comes in the payload from AVS. It's things like the card information, it's display information, it's audio player information. You can construct very complex tests against anything that's in that JSON. We're actually not showing it here, but this uses something called JSON path. It's a very robust way to work with the JSON and construct tests against it. But here we can test all those different aspects, really test to whatever level of depth is desired, and then to actually run these tests. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to run just this test file. We have a whole bunch of different tests, but in this case, just going to run this one. Now, the individual tests and the interactions don't run real fast. It runs at about the same speed as if you were talking to Alexa. But one thing you can do with this to speed it up that's not possible for normal human beings is you can actually simulate many different people talking to many different devices at the same time. So if you have a very complex interaction model that you want to test, it's possible to do that by running several tests in parallel. So that's how we can actually do it very quickly. In the meantime, while this runs, we can actually take a look at what's happening. If we look here, this is my Amazon account that this virtual device is associated with. And we can see these interactions happening in real time. So we can see this conversation as it's actually going on back and forth. And it should update here. Oh, no, it already finished. Okay. And so we ran our tests. And while it was running, so just to show you, if we pick on one of these interactions here, say what is on my list, I'm going to open, well, actually, I guess I can't easily show it. In this history, though, it's going to have each of these interactions, and we can actually play back and hear the audio that's generated.
What is on my list?
I don't think that's going to actually play out through my speaker, but if you go into this history, you can hear what Polly is saying, and you can use this to actually debug interaction model issues. So to the question before, where there's scenarios in which something is not heard correctly, you can go here and you can see, okay, I know this is what I told it to say, but this is what Alexa understood. And that's a way to actually debug interaction model issues. It's a really helpful thing. Additionally, we see the output from our tests here. And this is a case where actually the skill is not working correctly. We had an error here because it didn't understand the slot for bananas. So that's what you would think of as just basically a logic error. And then here, we actually have an error with what's coming back on the card title. Now in this case, this is an error with our test. We included these card tests just to show you how to set those up, but there's not actually cards here, so this is sort of an expected thing. We can also look at this report in HTML. So this is something that we've recently added, and so you have the capability to not just look at these test results on the command line, but you can also look at them in this nice HTML report. This is part of the sort of artifacts that I was talking about that are really helpful for your testing process and your certification process to have this set of results here. At any time you can refer back to this if there's a question around what was tested and what was the result of that testing. So this is a really nice thing. Going back to our testing file here, a couple of the things we would highlight. So you specify a locale as part of a configuration, and so we support actually all the locales that are supported by Alexa and Google currently, and you specify a voice ID. And so this is how you can get into testing some of the more subtle scenarios, because there's a whole slew of voices that are supported by Polly. And you can use that to test different languages, and you can also use that to test different accents. So this is a very helpful tool for doing some of that deeper sort of interaction model testing. And if we look at one of our tests in another language, it's very easy to write them. We've actually been successful at testing in languages that no one in our team speaks. We've written test cases that are fairly thorough in Japanese, for example, in which we rely on Google Translate, and then also just running things through the system to create this test case and then refine it. It's kind of amazing to be able to set up an automated test suite in a language that you don't even know, and it's actually pretty easy to do. So it's very easy to construct these test cases across different languages. It's a very valuable feature. There's not really an easy way to do that that I'm aware of outside of using a tool such as ours. One other thing that we would just highlight here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but we also offer an API underneath this. So you see our scripting syntax. It's very easy to work with. We actually use the same scripting syntax for unit testing and end-to-end testing, which we think is really cool. At the same time, if you want to do some more complex tests, we do offer this API. And so you can write tests using JavaScript. An example of where you might want to do this is if you had a list of 1,000 utterances or slot values that you wanted to test, rather than writing out a different test for each one using the YAML syntax. Instead, you could put all those utterance values into a flat file. You write a for loop, load all those values in, run them through, make sure that they're all working correctly, or at least get a report on which ones are working if there's any issues in there. Very easy to set that up, very easy to use this end-to-end API. In terms of when to use the API versus using the YAML, we think the YAML is great in that non-programmers, they can both write it and read it. So that's what we sort of steer people towards. But for those more complex dynamic tests, this API is really helpful. We're happy to talk with people, help them set up different proofs of concept around how to work with these tools. So please reach out to us if you do have questions. And then the last thing I'll touch upon before answering any of your questions is the continuous testing. You can just go to our dashboard to set this up. Very easy to set up your test case. It's basically using the same syntax that you're using for the end-to-end tests. But again, you're going to be not going to that same level of depth. The idea with the continuous testing is that you're running through sort of a happy path or a core sequence for your skill on this routine basis. It's not going to do that deep interaction model testing, but it is going to make sure that your skill is working. It's going to pick up any really strange stuff that happens with the infrastructure that you rely upon. Really allow you to sleep well at night knowing that there's not any problems with the skill. So we hope that that's a really helpful overview. With that, I'm going to stop sharing here and just use this time to answer any questions. And looking at the poll section here, thank you for everyone that responded. If you haven't responded, please do take a look at that. And so I see. So in the absence, oh, I see. Actually, there's a question here from Jeffrey. If I understood correctly, you're using speech to text to convert Alexa's spoken responses into text and then comparing that to the expected response. Does that introduce its own errors? So speech to text is imperfect and it will have errors. That is correct. But we actually have some simple ways to work around that. One is those wildcards that I showed you. That's a really simple mechanism. One case that we saw very frequently was in a skill that it was confusing the word white for wife. And so what you can do is where it's hearing wife, you replace that with a wildcard. Very simple solution. Additionally, we have this configuration feature in which you can enable homophones. And so you can set up a homophone, and what that will do is it will automatically replace in that actual response one word or phrase with another. So in that same scenario, you can set up a homophone for white with the word wife, and that will automatically be replaced in the response, and it will perform those checks as if it had recognized it correctly. So those are both really simple mechanisms to overcome any errors that happen with the speech recognition. I will say it's a great question, because I think for people that are new to using our tooling, that's probably the trickiest part. But those techniques and those options that we provide, they do make it very easy to sort of work around it. Once you get used to it, it's very easy to set up those tests, and it doesn't really tend to be much of an issue at all. And just while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, so I have a question for the people that are on this. What has been the hardest part around certification? What are the biggest challenges that you've run into with it? Anyone want to weigh in on that? I'm trying to, so for me, I would say, one scenario I ran into that I thought was rather interesting was an issue with an invocation name. And this does go to the sort of judgmental aspect of certification, where the person who is looking at the skill said, gee, this invocation name doesn't perform well. I tried saying it a number of times and it wasn't recognized properly. And in that scenario, this was actually before we built any of our tools, I just said, well, gee, I tried it 20 times and it worked all 20 times. So it really does seem like, whatever the issue with the invocation name was, was something that was quirky that happened for you. It would have been so much better to be able to use our end-to-end testing tools and show that report. Like, look, we ran it 20 times, we used 20 different voices, and it worked for all of them. That's very compelling evidence that it's a good invocation name. Or, on the other side, if you run it 20 times using the automated testing, using different voices, if it's not working correctly, then you know something important, which is that you haven't picked a good invocation name. And that's great information to know. Yeah, following all the rules for invocation phrases. It's definitely tricky. I think that is a big challenge. I guess, so another experience I would share with certification, now this is one we don't help with automated testing, but the security requirements, they can be tricky, especially around, ensuring the signatures are valid, ensuring SSL is configured correctly. We tend to host things on our own using containers. It hasn't happened since probably the first one that I submitted, but definitely not having that stuff set up correctly the first time, that is something that I've been dinged for. You definitely do want to check those security requirements, make sure that you're tying off on all of them. Not hard to do, but it's easy to miss them, especially during the development phase. You may not see that, but they will check those. There's a good question. Is there an average time it takes for Alexa certification? I don't know what the average time is, but I believe the SLA is 5 days. You definitely hear different stories in the wild about different times. I've heard developers that have, that I would say are very expert brag about being able to get things through in just a day or two. That may be somewhat partially based on their own relationship with folks, but the standard time is 5 days. And that, the goal that we have for people that are using our software or that we're helping with the certification Fastlane that we mentioned is to get it through cleanly the first time. You can't control how quickly it gets tested. I think even if you're very prominent, you still may have to wait a couple days. But what you can control is making sure that you've really tested all those things very thoroughly. So that's a good point, Jeffrey. Haven't encountered this yet, but I'm worried that the rules concerning customer data collection and access via permissions aren't very explicitly stated. Could trip us up. And I don't recall those off the top of my head, but that is something to be careful of. Obviously, you do want to stay within their guidelines on that. And obviously, it's also easier if you're not doing a lot of data collection. But that's not always, possible. For some skills, that sort of data collection is endemic to it. And then you do need to be careful that you're mindful of the user's privacy as well as the guidelines that Amazon provides. And I see there's another question from Guy. Does the Alexa Amazon team experience backlogs and certification around peak times like the holidays? That's a great question. Again, we don't have statistics on that, but anecdotally, we've certainly heard, even from people at Amazon, that yes, there can be backlogs on that. We would love to report that through using our automated testing, you'll get it through even faster. I don't think I'm giving too much away in saying that we're pursuing with Amazon that they would support us in that. They're not at this point. But we would love it if, having done your testing with Bespoken, got you through that certification quagmire even faster. It certainly will allow you to ensure that your skill is working correctly so that you're less likely to fall into a backlog because it gets rejected. All right, so we are just about out of time here, but really appreciate everyone joining for this webinar. We hope you found it really helpful. Like I said before, we'll be sending out the recording of this as well as the slides. And certainly please do reach out if you have any questions for us, whether or not you want to use the tools or even if you want to take advantage of our certification Fastlane service. We'll provide that contact information and love to chat with you about it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon and rest of your morning.